I would like to ask you to turn on your cameras for the moment to make let's say a little bit of eye contact and greet each other in this morning, and welcome actually our final guest in the lecture series, Professor Hélène Frichot, who will be introduced a little bit later, and she will remain a little bit mysterious. But I would also like to welcome Charlotte Malter-Barth, our, we see the book, yes, okay, so she is not so mysterious. Nicholas, thanks for that. So Charlotte, fantastic. Charlotte is with us again from let's say, virtually from Harvard. Also great honor and pleasure. And Charlotte, in fact, has been the link who enabled the Hélène to be our guest this morning. So we will start immediately with our concepts. Metaxia, if you would like to share the screen. The concepts will, let's say, open our minds and the kind of intellectual channels and associative channels for Helene's talk. And the terms are care. Sorry, you have to change your slide, Metaxia.
Yes. So hello and good morning from me. So as always, before starting the lecture, we introduce our guest through two words that she has chosen for you. So the first word or phrase actually in this case is dig and dump. So the ones of you with a last name starting from A to M, please take a blue pen and A4 page and tell us what you think when you hear dig and dump. And the second word is care. So the ones of you with last names starting from N to Z, you hold the red pen, the word care. And as always, we give you 6 minutes, 5 minutes, starting from now. You can tell us or actually draw with lines what you think or what you imagine when you hear these phrases. You can relate it to what we have discussed so far or also not. And at the end of the 5 minutes, we will share a common exhibition in the WhatsApp group, and Hélène will be here to comment with us what you did. So time started already.
Perhaps we can just remind the students that these guest lectures, or to a certain extent, the entire lecture series was curated around the notion of my Earth, where we are basically highlighting, exploring different dimensions of that relationship from, for instance, let's say, investigations related to Anthropocene and post-Anthropocene that Alexandra Wren presented with her cartographies. Then we have looked at the Earth in the sense of soil, the meaning of soil, the materiality, the ecology of soil, the kind of soil in the urban realm and beyond the urban realm. We have seen talks by soil scientists which talked about nutrient cycles. We have seen a lecture of a young architect who explores urban soils as a basis for urban design. Therefore, he is kind of pushing the boundaries of the discipline. We have then heard the lecture by Charlotte, who spoke about arable lands, who spoke about the land in terms of property, in terms of also potential for development. So the kind of with the cases being mainly on the fringes of Cairo. And now we are approaching this very interesting and I think crucial kind of convergence of the notion of earth or soil and that of dirt, right? So what are we talking about here actually? So dig and dump and care, earth and dirt. Can we? How do we begin to resonate between these terms?
You have still a few minutes, but I will stop sharing my screen so we can have a view of the students if the cameras are on.
I think these terms are a little bit out of the usual, you know, even though we try to not obviously be in the mold, but somehow they really push beyond, to say so, our let's say discourse, and I think that's really exciting. But we have now 2 contributions in the WhatsApp, Bill. Okay.
So maybe I can already start sharing the exhibition so we can start commenting.
It's such a wonderful idea. I love this exercise.
Yes, it's in fact it's really a challenge. I mean, the point is, of course, to break the kind of frontal model, right? And when we are like 200 in auditorium, how do we actually, you know, engage and you know, what is the kind of modality of doing that? So so this was in fact developed initially as an exercise in a live auditorium where people would literally, let's say, you know, sketch on an A4 sheet, and then they actually walk down from their seat to a kind of a large wall, and everybody pins their drawing, and there is a kind of instant exhibition, which was really fun to do. And this is now our virtual version.
So I invite everybody, Hélène, Charlotte, Milica, Güler, to comment. I will be going through the images, so just jump in any moment. Oh. And it's always surprising to us how some sketches share ideas or imaginations about those terms.
So dig and dump seems to inspire sectional interpretation.
Dig and dump, yes, it's a lot about cut and fill, yes.
Yeah, that's for sure. I don't know how many people have looked at the little book Dirty Theory yet, but some of the dig and dump images look very much like the very basic line that I drew in Dirty Theory that sort of is just that sort of, yeah. And then if we multiply that globally, it becomes a very disturbing diagram. I love all the machines here.
Yeah.
And this one's really destroying the environment on both sides.
Yeah, it's causing erosion. Yeah. Okay, well, Red Cross. Is that Red Cross?
Yeah, we've got some care.
Yes.
Oh, that's nice. Actually, I can't remember whether it was when I looked up the word, maybe it's when you Google the word care, actually. I'd have to try it. I think when you Google the word care, or is it nature? So these look like some people have been Googling the words. Yeah, because I think it's either care or the word nature. Then you find the same image again and again. So it's a really funny exercise to Google a word and search images, because there are these produces curious effects.
You're absolutely right. So next time, I think what we should do in this exercise, we should Google and show the kind of Google images that appear for these terms, so that these will be, to say so, eliminated, because they will be part of a kind of a common consciousness. But here we have a kind of a Robert Smithson that was on the dig and dump, the asphalt rundown. No, this. So this is the art reference. Yeah.
Dig and dump also always has machines, almost.
always says
Yeah, never dig.
Is that a satellite or a helmet?
Helmet with two.
Okay.
Yeah.
maybe the student can say, actually, why not?
Daniela.
What is the flying object?
The helmet.
Can you hear me?
Daniela.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
It should remind of the toxic symbol with the skull.
Ah,
Ah.
it's a dead skull, but actually it's a helmet and shovels, right?
Okay. Okay, go.
Yeah, but that gives a whole different, commentary on the image, no? If it's that hovering threat, I don't know.
Care, yeah. I mean, is it a kind of duty or care, right? So what is in a way the difference there? I guess it's also a question.
I'm sorry, I got a bit.
No, that's right. And I'll very briefly at the end of the lecture today list a number of feminist theorists of care, because care ethics has a long tradition in philosophy, starting with someone like Carol Gilligan, for instance. But most recently, I think she was a doctoral student of Donna Haraway. You might have come across Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who writes of matters of care. And she points out very specifically that care is not always a positive thing. You know, care can be that unwanted care where it can be quite oppressive. Like, I don't want your care, which is confining me, you know, whether in some kind of clinic perhaps, or in...
here we have it, the clinic. Yes, here it is.
Yeah.
This is pretty good. That's really hits the point. Yeah.
I like too that it's incorrectly orientated. Yeah.
Yes.
So now, although this is a very sweet image with the hands holding the globe, that would be the image that would have to be, unfortunately, not allowed, because I think this would be the kind of image we might find if we Googled care.
Yeah, this is
It's an NGO logo.
It's also not really genuine, like, do we really care for the entire earth, and what is the kind of really anatomy of that emotion, let's say? I think so. In a way, this kind of more situated idea of care is perhaps more interesting in this case.
I think this one is very nice because it talks about the kind of materialization of it. So it's not the kind of digging. It's about how that piece of earth that is there actually materialize in a built form, right? I think that's actually very...
Yeah. Oh, that one's dark.
Okay. Yes.
It's not that one, bad. Please.
It's commenting on extinction, I think, this one.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, it's okay. It's getting care. Okay, this is care for the land, a kind of gardening. Kind of gardening. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, another tip truck. I do love all the machines that are appearing.
It's very interesting for me how care comes always with the hands. It's embodied as a concept somehow.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. A focus on the hands. A manual labor of the hands.
Dig and dump Swiss tradition, interesting. Gotthard past.
Oh yeah,
and, it's about the tunnels of Switzerland, and then the kind of dumping of the tunnel material, which is a big topic in Switzerland.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. This one looks like it's got a beach ball in it, but I think it's not meant to be a beach ball. I think it's like a toxic
hazard.
Toxic, yeah, it's
hazard
toxic waste, yeah.
But you could play with that a bit, because you could make it look like something fun, like at the beach, but then it's got its dark side when you recognize it's not a beach ball. In fact, it's a hazard sign. So it's sort of, you know, the ambivalence of these activities of digging and dumping, drawing our attention to children's play, you know.
Hélène, someone asks for the exact name of the reference you were mentioning earlier, the Haraway student.
Maria.
Okay. Oh yes, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, and you'll find it. I've got an image of her book in the lecture.
Great.
It's yeah, there it is.
Perfect, thank you.
In fact, oh, you're welcome, Matthias. Yeah, care for the aged. This has become a huge issue, of course, amidst COVID-19.
Yeah.
Given the huge impact in aged care facilities or institutions.
Oh, this is also
the soup line.
The soup kitchen, yeah.
Oh, there's a real sense of a quarry in this one.
Yeah, this is really a kind of extraction complex.
Oh, that's a bit more complex.
Yeah.
Softness and reactivity, right?
Oh,
maybe.
Yeah, there's almost a.
Leonie, what you wrote?
Yes, of course. Well, it says like softness and reactivity, and I think like I had a very positive concept of care in mind as like opposed to individualism.
Very nice.
Yeah, it's very nice. I mean, it speaks of some interconnectivity without necessarily spelling it, which is quite nice.
Great. It also speaks about that reaction or the kind of limits of that Helen mentioned in the context of clinics, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, that one, a very symmetrical relationship between digging and dumping.
Yeah, this is
geological geometrics.
Yeah, very, very, indeed, there is a kind of powerful geometry about it, yes.
Oh, this is a tiny little man inside a tunnel. Oh, that's great. Oh, it took me a while to see him or her.
He's a bit trapped in the cave now, though.
Yeah. The band-aid, first aid.
By the way, since we're talking about care, there is a very interesting exhibition at the moment at Neuchâtel about the Swiss missionaries in different parts of the world, which I think exposes exactly what you said, this kind of critical look of what care might also mean, not necessarily in a positive way.
Unwanted care, yeah. I'm sure we could tell many stories of that kind in the Australian context with the original custodians, the Indigenous Australians, all the unwanted cares of the missions set up here.
In fact, I think Amira Haas, which is an Israeli journalist, has an old kind of theory around the bulldozer as a kind of machine of war in the context of the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, it looks almost like what you're saying in this one, no? It's a kind of a construction of trenches, you know?
Exactly. No, and it also talks about, you know, for instance, she gives a very salient example with if you have a road and if you basically have a bulldozer or caterpillar or anything like that, and you just like make like this over the asphalt, you basically just you create a kind of mount, and that takes something like, I don't know, 10 minutes, and then the road is not practicable for anyone anymore. And you can actually install there a kind of military post. So it has a kind of component of destruction. And yeah, I mean, all these, the ones that are drawn now are very cute. They're like this kind of iconic, you know, toy-like, but actually I would also agree that with her that they're actually very warlike machines, I think.
Dig and dump, we have we have it again.
We have the dark ones are coming back.
We have the dark one again, yeah.
I think Maria Mari
here we
has
have
joined.
it on. Here we have it as a kind of planetary diagram. That's now interesting. Yeah, this one is kind of connecting the dots.
I'm going to have to jump off. Is that going to work? Is it okay to introduce me?
So thank you, Helen. So Helen will. I just want to tell the students. So Helen will leave us for about an hour. We will introduce her and listen to a pre-recorded talk, and then she will come back for our debate.
I might even just stay there kind of in the background. So I won't even pop out of Zoom. I'll just like leave myself there. Okay.
Yeah, that's,
so I'm
perfect. So we are looking forward to discuss afterwards.
At the other end. Okay. Looking forward to seeing you shortly. Okay. All right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so already Helen is gone. Maybe a few words about her. So Helen is an architectural theorist and philosopher, a writer and a critic. She's a professor of architecture and philosophy at the School of Architecture in Melbourne, in Australia. She has been a guest professor, but also a former director of critical studies in architecture in Stockholm. And I have to say I'm extremely intrigued by her research topic, which is pretty dirty and messy, let's say, because she challenges all our imaginations about cleanness and its positive but also negative or authoritative aspects. And she's bringing into the table of discussion the idea of a dirty theory, aiming to trouble actually architecture. She has also worked on creative ecologies. And maybe I would also pass the speech to Charlotte, who was the one who brought us in contact with Helen, and we're really grateful about that. So Charlotte, I don't know if you want to add also something on this.
No, I mean, I think what I thought when we were putting together somehow and discussing, you know, what is this idea of soil and land, I think that there were many topics that were, you know, let's say, very grounded, and we were like talking about the soil, and in a way the kind of, I think that the whole discussion was very nicely kind of broadening, and I think that was the reason why the work of Hélène was coming to mind was to, I say, contextualize it in let's say larger discussions of care, as she talked about, but she has also her own take on dirt as something that is very much related to let's say environmental matters, but in a way that it's grounded in like feminist theories and also more generally, let's say even everyday matters and how we deal with dirt as a kind of concept or as objects, in fact, on everyday. And I think that since she's also an architect, I think she's able to bridge these kind of discussions, I would say, and this is why I am very happy that she's ending the series. I think that it's a really nice. It's almost like a crescendo in scale as well. Somehow it's about, you know, talking about the soil, these kind of microorganisms that are in below us, and then we've kind of unpacked it to you know, several layers going up. You know, how does the property lines are actually, you know, then on the crust, and then in relation to the environment, but also, let's say, more conceptually, also what does it mean to look at these questions. So I think she's a wonderful speaker for addressing this kind of question, and in a way taking a little bit of distance and asking ourselves these kinds of questions.
I mean, of course, and I think this is fantastic to try to somehow begin linking across the disciplines, you know, or kind of it's a certain also interdisciplinary section, right? So Alexandra is a landscape architect, Johan Six is a soil scientist, right? Antoine and you're, let's say, architects, urbanists. Helen is a philosopher, right? So I think, and we could have gone, I mean, if we had to say so another semester, we could have gone exploring the issues in different directions, right? So it's important, I think, let's say for me, this kind of interdisciplinarity is a really important aspect and the kind of territorial questions as a kind of and design, even, you know, design, or our discipline really as a kind of opportunity for synthesis among of the different bodies of knowledge. No? So let's go on with the lecture.
My name's Hélène Frichot, and today I'm going to lead you through a lecture about dirty theory. In fact, I'm going to look most specifically at dirt and decolonisation. And because of this, it's important to commence by acknowledging that I live and work on the unceded lands of the traditional owners here in the Melbourne Victorian area, the original custodians, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, who have managed country and the stories that go with it for millennia. So I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, here's this small book that I'm going to tell you about today, and I'm going to launch in by explaining that when it comes to dirty theory, there is nothing very respectable about it. It seeks out approaches and plots trajectories from a position close to the ground. We must move past our disgust to work with the dirt. This is an imperative for coping with our dusty, dirty, defiled world, to think with it, not against it. Dirt never emerges from nowhere, but from beneath your feet, from under your fingernails, from amidst the skein of encounters and relations that compose any mode of life. A life, any life whatever, is inevitably dirty, messy, buffeted by contingencies. What was once sacred and revered, in the next moment may well be expelled as abject, judged to be without sense, useless, noise. The dirty theorist follows the materials, tracks the soiled effluent, observing from where it came in the direction that it appears to be taking. She is unafraid of selecting at will from the sedimented and dusty archive of thinking. It's important to stress that with this project, Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture, that it erupts from a backlog of thoughts collected in notebooks and a digital folder for a good 10 years. But in its execution as a small book, it was achieved in a rush of enthusiasm, quickly, perhaps too quickly. In a way, it comes after this other small book that you see on the slide now, How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool, which in its construction composes something of a playful instruction manual to explore feminist theories and practices. Now, with this small book, though, what subsequently happened was it became the testing ground for this larger, longer book, where the theories and practices that I was concerned with around creative ecologies could be developed in more depth. So I suppose I mention this background work because I have hopes that perhaps, with any luck, dirty theory might be able to develop its concerns in the future. Now, this idea of dirty theory, it's important to stress that it's not a new idea, but something already besmirched with use. It's been passed here and there like a bill of sale with notes scribbled on its face. David Gisson, for instance, has already been there with his book Subnatures, Architecture's Other Environments, which is relevant not only for its subject matter, dedicated to smog, smoke, pigeons, insects, mud, debris, but also for the fact of the genesis of Gisson's book, which were the leftovers from his doctoral dissertation. So he went back to these leftovers and recovered them. It's like he kind of took the dirt of his PhD and turned them into a compelling book about the relation between architecture and these sorts of smoggy, dirty effluents. For me, though, dirty theory becomes an excuse as well to return to the work of such important American thinkers and practitioners as Jennifer Bloomer, especially active through the 80s and 90s, especially her dirty drawings and her dirty ditties. That's the way in which she would play with language. In fact, with my colleague Emma Cheetle at Sheffield University, will be returning to Bloomer in a special issue of the Journal of Architecture that we're currently working on and that will hopefully be published in 2022. It's also an excuse for me to return to the work of the late Catherine Schoenfeld, who was known for her collaboration with Liza Fior of Muff Art Architecture in London, a practice that undertakes a lot of participatory work with communities. And Schoenfeld is also known for her essays and her installations. For instance, her occupation of an underground toilet, I suppose, public toilet in London, which she lined with goose feathers and named Dirt is Matter Out of Place. In naming her installation Dirt is Matter Out of Place, she's making a sly reference to a very well-known definition of dirt given by Mary Douglas, an ethnographer. And I'm going to come back to this definition shortly. We also find venturing into the domain of dirt, geographers such as Ben Camkin and Rosie Cox, who have who've been involved in a couple of book publications and also in an exhibition at the Wellcome Centre in London that was entirely dedicated to dirt. They debate in a certain amount of detail the influential work of Mary Douglas. Now, for me, in locating dirt and dirty theory, I'm further drawing broadly on the emerging domains of the environmental humanities and the environmental humanities specifically where it intersects with the post-humanities. Dirty theory for me assumes what could be called a relational ontology. That is, informing our spaces and subjectivities and positions. We do so via material power relations that are both open and enabling, as well as oppressive. So dirt and dirty theory. Dirty theory takes dirt broadly defined as its subject and resituates dirt in order to propose a dirty methodology. Subject and methodology, both dirt and dirty theory. If we follow the material we call or classify as dirt or dirty, then it demands approaches that, as I've said, are not very respectable. As an approach, it is a little breathless for the encroaching smog, we could say. It is too quick, it jumps here and there, it opens and closes subjects and cases in a peremptory manner. And this, I suggest, is because it senses a certain urgency concerning our contemporary environments. Dirty theory attempts the difficult process of what philosopher of science Isabelle Stengers calls an immanent critique. That is how to undertake a critique from the midst of things, par le milieu, or from the milieu or environment we find ourselves in. Undertaking critique without being able to claim the conceit of a critical distance or the God trick or pure objectivity and omniscience. This is what Stengers, sometimes interlocutor Donna Haraway, calls situated knowledges. That is, how do we offer another approach to our research engagements and our practice engagements that doesn't assume omniscience, but instead acknowledges that we're situated somewhere, someplace. Our situated knowledges are, according to Haraway, partial and fragmentary, and yet in collaboration with each other, we're able to form an adequate account and thereby to act collectively accordingly. So it's ethos, the ethos of dirty theory. What it expresses is something that is an approach that calls on us to follow the materials of our environment worlds. And as I proceed further, I'll have some good examples of what I mean by this urgent sort of ethical imperative to follow materials, which is also to acknowledge our deep relational embeddedness. Very much inspired by my own long-time engagement in reading the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, but also his reading of the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, the key mantra to be found in dirty theory, which is also to be found in How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool and in Creative Ecologies, is exactly to follow the materials. Its tactics thereby include gleaning, which is an approach that I describe in creative ecologies. That is, a picking up of scraps, a going over territories already colonized to ask searching questions, because perhaps there are some leftovers, some minor connections yet to be made, or some way out that challenges a settled status quo. Here too, dirty theory intersects with the methodology of exhaustion introduced in my book, Creative Ecologies, in that it argues that at the limits of exhaustion, perhaps some creative speculative act is still possible. Dirty theory, and here it is from the ethnographer Mary Douglas that I compose this argument, at last perhaps suggests some creative gesture. Through its sequence of somewhat disarticulated parts, as you see here on the contents page, dirty theory is finally something of a promissory note to myself as a future author, who may be able to find or steal the time to get in more deeply, to get dirtier, and to attempt a slow rendering of the themes and sites that begin to take some kind of lump and shape when it comes to dirt and dirty theory. For instance, the brief chapter on dirt and colonisation, which seems to be the most promising right now, including the line that is cut, a geological one, according to Catherine Yusof, that runs through gender, class, and race. To be marked, to be besmirched with one's sex, with one's purported race, to be sexualized and racialized, which is to be classified in advance of a recognition of one's singular capacities, becomes a kind of question or domain that dirty theory needs to investigate and counter, offering its own modes of creative resistance. I'm going to return to this chapter, which is chapter 11 on dirt and colonisation, or dirt and decolonisation, below. First, though, a little bit more about the framing of dirty theory. You'll have noticed, perhaps, if you picked up the little brown book, that its subtitle is Troubling Architecture. Here, the troubling brings the issue of gender fully into the frame of reference, gender and questions of intersectionality, I would say. Where Donna Haraway, for instance, argues that we stay with the trouble, she alerts us to the problems caused when we attempt to clean ourselves up. She plays with the dirt, which she takes as a material semiotic mix, stressing that it matters what stories tell stories. Rather than the humanities, she argues, for instance, she offers in her kind of playful material semiotic, dirty writing, the notion of the humosities, humus being what happens to dirt once organic matter begins to rot, giving off heat, making good soil, where life-sustaining stuff must grow. So here too is where we find that dirt is deeply ambivalent. It's both bad for us, it can infect and contaminate us, but when it transforms itself into, the good soil, then it's something that is life-sustaining. It's that material in which we grow our crops. When we turn to Judith Butler, well-known feminist philosopher, especially with her early work, Gender Trouble, Feminism and Subversion of Identity from 1990, a work that kind of exploded out of the late 80s into the 90s, we find here in this work around this theme of troubling, a challenging of any assumptions around achieving a biologically essentialist fix on sex, or a universal and stable identity for gender. Butler troubles gender, alerting us to how messy identities really are and how trouble is always bound up in prevalent power relations. Gender is willful, performative, apt to pervert the course of conventional categories. It makes trouble. The simple moral of Butler's pronouncement is as follows: what we expel, the dirty, the abject, is exactly what composes us, what we already are. When Butler writes Gender Troubles, she in fact makes reference to the ethnographer Mary Douglas, to speak of how Douglas assumes that the dirtiness or unruliness of the body comes to be marked and ordered, or there are attempts to tame it through specific codes of cultural coherence, how the body and its kind of leakiness comes to be organized or constrained through social taboos. So we also find especially that certain vulnerabilities of a body, and a body here can be a human body, it can be a body of water, it can be a land body, become vulnerable at the margins. So let's move on finally, though, to this early definition of dirt. It is the anthropologist Mary Douglas who famously offers the sort of neatest definition of dirt. Simply, dirt is matter out of place, matter located where it is judged not to belong, judged as such by someone, or rather judged by some societal context, organised around societal norms and structures. Douglas explains that this simple formula directs us toward order and then the contravention of ordered relations. Dirt is that which crosses boundaries, challenges decorum, contravenes norms. The low, the reduced, the underfoot, the despised, the rejected, the expelled are at the same moment the accumulated ground upon which the powerful steady themselves in order to reach the rarefied heights. So we have this idea of the fundamental role of what is considered dirty. Douglas's formula, in fact, and this is a particular interest to me, is derived from the work of the pragmatist philosopher William James. So here, entering into the picture of these kinds of fields of theories, is the tradition of pragmatist philosophy. Douglas quotes James at length in a passage that concludes, "Here we have the interesting notion of there being elements of the universe which may make no rational whole in conjunction with the other elements, and which, from the point of view of any system which those elements make up, can only be considered so much irrelevance and accident, so much dirt, as it were, and matter out of place. That is to say, that which appears to disrupt systems and threaten the infrastructures that support everyday life, that which undoes social relations and causes political unrest, that which lacks sense or threatens a milieu, social or otherwise, with nonsense, irrelevance and accident, belongs in the category that James defines as dirt." But sometimes, of course, that which doesn't belong, that which troubles a social milieu, is exactly that which is needed to overturn a set of relations, power relations that have become oppressive. As Ben Campkin and Rosie Cox have argued from their position as geographers, so they take up Mary Douglas's ethnographic work and attempt to spatialize it through their work as geographers. Douglas's formula is one that invites multiple interpretations. There is a lot of kind of contest around how we understand this definition of dirt being matter out of place. I'm particularly interested in the fact that, given that she's citing the pragmatist philosopher William James, we're brought back to this tradition of pragmatist philosophy. And I'm not going to go into it today, but this is interesting for me because of some of the recent work that has been undertaken collaboratively between philosophers of science such as Isabelle Stengers and her sometime collaborator Didier Debes, who in fact both read the work of Whitehead, a mathematician who late in his career became a philosopher, who was himself influenced by William James. And this leads us toward this thought of a speculative empiricism, which is a kind of wonderful kind of a paradoxical conjunction that asks us to kind of locate ourselves on the ground amidst our experience and our everyday experimentation, but to take this grounded position and to speculate. So we have a double move, producing what Stengers and Debes introduce under the notion of a speculative gesture. And part of what this speculative gesture demands, it's not speculation as we find it, for instance, in property development. It's rather speculation as a demand to kind of think more carefully about what we're in the middle of doing. They explain that something like the speculative gesture, bound up in a speculative empiricism, demands that we slow down. The critical gesture that is the speculative gesture can be deployed in order to hesitate, to survey the scene before us or in the midst of which we find ourselves, to get a feel for what might happen next, what might happen to our modes of thought, so that we might render environmental relations in a different way, We are suffering, Didier Debes and Isabelle Stengers argue, we're suffering a crisis of thinking that is bound up with our global environmental crises. We must urgently place thinking under the sign of the possible. We must place the speculative amidst our sort of empirical, experiential, experimental ventures. In fact, this is the kind of work that Isabelle Doucet and myself attempted in this special edition of Architectural Theory Review, Resist, Reclaim, Speculate, Situated Perspectives on Architecture in the City, where there was an aim to sort of locate ourselves par le milieu amidst, contemporary problems as they're troubling us and begin to speculate from those situations. This often also involved telling stories, which is an important methodology part that can, be considered part of this notion of dirty theory. And it also involves a certain attitude when it comes to gestures of art, design, or architecture. Ones that, gestures that are less aimed toward, constructing the ever new or gestures less directed at innovation for the sake of innovation, but rather something that emphasizes maintenance and repair. Another key work that sort of I would align this project with would be Peg Raws's work on relational architectural ecologies. And here on the front page and in Peg Raws's own chapter, we find Agnes Dennis with her wheat field undertaking this slow work of reclaiming a former rubbish dump just outside of New York by planting wheat there. In fact, in the background, you can still see the Twin Towers, which I believe when the rubble was being cleared there was returned to this former dump site. That at this moment in the 80s, Agnes Dennis is reclaiming with comments on, food shortages, with a retort to Wall Street that's nearby and so forth. So we have an act of something like the maintenance of life at work here. Another very famous example would be Mel Ukele's durational performances and performances of cleaning amidst institutions. Here is her work, Washing Tracks Maintenance, outside the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum, Hartford, Connecticut, where basically she's drawing attention to the invisible labour that's undertaken amidst our institutions, the invisible labour of cleaning staff, for instance, drawing attention to the importance of this daily labour of maintenance. Her other famous works, of course, include her touch sanitation performance, which took place between June 1979 and June 1980 across the districts of New York, where, much like an ethnographer, she followed the daily rounds and rituals of sanitation workers, listening into what they had to say. And her investigation included a further performance entitled Handshake and Thanking Ritual, which you can see her undertaking here, where she solemnly and sincerely shakes the hands of the sanitation workers, thanking them for their invaluable contributions to society. So she thanks those who are, involved in the dirty work, and she literally shakes their hands, which is a sort of symbol of such trust here, taking on their dirt, so to speak. Very much inspired by these sort of feminist performative works, we have the more recent explorations of the interior designer artist Juliana Preston. Here she's undertaking ground maintenance in In-Space Gallery in Edinburgh as part of a conference that took place in October 2013 called Plentitude and Emptiness, a symposium of architectural research by design at the University of Edinburgh. Very much inspired also by this sort of approach of repair and maintenance with former colleagues Sepide Karami, Hannes Freikom and Adria Carbonell. We organised a design studio at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology at Stockholm, with an emphasis on infrastructural love and infrastructural care. And here we see Marlon Bergman, who explores a sort of speculative design proposal wherein she aims to care both for the grounds of a former airfield, the Barkarby airfield, so caring and remediating the soil, as well as caring for the labourers who are undertaking the work there. So there's this understanding of the human and non-human relation in this work. So this leads us also, you know, dirty theory is all very well as a notion, but how do we kind of mobilise it amidst our practice experiments? And here I'm very inspired by some of the early work again of Jennifer Bloomer, who introduces notions of the dirty drawing. The dirty drawing for Bloomer is neither representation nor working drawing, but something composed after the fact, which pollutes both, she says. Bloomer explains that the dirty drawing addresses architectural representation by colliding the rendering with the working drawing, that is, by colliding the sacred with the profane. So, you know, the sacred image of your rendered, you know, architectural project, that kind of pure image is messed up with the working drawing, which is kind of dirty, which is getting down to the kind of pragmatic aspect of the work. And so Bloomer, by mixing these, says that she produces what she calls a dirty drawing. At the same time, what her aim is, I suppose, as she explains, is to point to the fetishistic role of the image in architecture. So this is also to challenge what we do with our images in architecture. Katie Lloyd-Thomas explains that Bloomer's dirty drawings delve into the improper domains of materiality and tactility, which she explores specifically through the use of organic inks on rough paper. So there's also the use of certain materials that wouldn't normally be proper in architecture in these dirty drawings. Jane Rendell explains that Bloomer, through her dirty drawings and her incorporation of parts of the female anatomy, breasts, milk, fluids, blood, hatching udders into architecture, that what Bloomer does is generates a critique of the sterility of the architectural drawing process. We also have in Bloomer's installations the inclusion of materials that, you know, are that are poor or refuse or strange materials. We have bits of canvas and cord, lace, fake fingernails, glass beads, oyster shells, fishing lures that are homemade, even a cowhide in the Abodes of Flesh project, which is described here. Pink lycra, mattress batting, beeswax, all of these materials that, you know, don't belong in architecture in terms of installations and model making. In terms of Bloomer's approach to what I described dirty ditties, when she writes her exquisitely crafted essays, she includes a lot of sort of wordplay and also brings her own autobiographical situation into the stories that she's telling, mixing up proper academic discourse with, you know, autobiographical hints of her family and her marital life. Again, we learned from this in our Infrastructural Love and Cares studio through the production of our dirty models, for instance. Here's an example from Marie Larosic. And here's Marie's production of the pigeon towers in a former industrial site. Again, with an emphasis on multi-species relations, human, non-human relations. The pigeons here collecting the dirt of the site and their wings being kind of studied to understand how much pollutant is in the air. This was the sort of speculative project Marie was exploring. But this brings us now finally to the focus of the lecture, which is to talk about dirt and decolonisation. People everywhere, human subjects classified as foreigners, migrants, ethnic others, minorities, women and children, or the enslaved, are often assigned the derogatory denomination of dirt or dirty. They are cast out, rejected, treated as subjects of dangerous contagion. The other is assigned that place outside as foreign material, but this displacement is procured in order to fortify that which is the same, through regimes of slavery, indentured labour, a silent infrastructure of exhausted, racialised bodies, cleaning, ever cleaning, forever cleaning. this is how I open the chapter on dirt and colonisation. And it's important for me to draw on the work of a number of others who have gone deeper into this question. We have, for instance, Françoise Verger, who places gender, waste and decolonisation together into one dirty bundle. She does so to draw attention to the existential exhaustion that plagues the daily labours of maintenance delegated to thousands of Black and brown women, migrants and refugees the world over. The exhausted bodies of women of colour serve a racial capitalism, she explains, that rests upon an economy of exhaustion. Or we have Rauna Kuakanen, who introduces dirty theory as a project of decolonisation specifically, and I quote her, "Through dirty theory, we ensure that voice is not taken as representative and totalising or universalising. Voice work that homogenises groups of people can be seen as epistemic ignorance, as the academic practices and discourses that enable the continued exclusion of other than dominant Western epistemic and intellectual traditions." So we have across both of these offerings the question of the material relations of labouring bodies, but also the importance of voice and representation and who can be heard to speak and whose discourse will change our knowledge practices. Isabelle Stengers, following this vein of, in fact, how we decolonising our very structures of thought, cites Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who describes the imperative to undertake a decolonisation of thought, which is a reclaiming of other possibilities for philosophy, but for our general practices of thinking together. And this becomes a matter of resisting the colonising power that seeks to judge or even simply to tolerate that which is deemed civilised, and knowledge practices and belief systems that are judged to be questionable. So it's about listening in to other forms of knowledge practice for Isabelle Stengers. It's about questioning what those guardians of knowledge presume to be guarding. Now, further to this domain of dirt and decolonisation, the emergence of extraction and extractivism, or discourse around modes of extraction, becomes very important. So quite simply, forms of mining and how these displace Indigenous communities, how they have historically enslaved the workers who are extracting the materials, and how global inequalities are produced through these activities. But first, I want to start here in the middle of Australia at the scenic lookout Kubapedi, which is opal mine territory. You'll see this mound of rubble here, and what I want to use this for is an experiment, a thought experiment that's often described within the around Anthropocene discourse. So the Anthropocene being that geological era that describes the massive impact of human industrial activity embedded into the very geological material of the earth, into the lithosphere, into the oceans of the earth that have been so completely materially transformed due to the sort of impact of the species human sort of interactions. And the thought experiment that I'm describing is the one that asks, who is that imagined future other who will bear witness to the destruction that we've wrought on a planetary scale? Who looks back? What happens in regarding our landscapes and our sort of, transformed and damaged landscapes? What happens when those very landscapes look back at us? So I'm trying to kind of set up this notion of the scenic lookout and attempting to imagine a post-human point of view when the landscape regards the passing of the human, for instance, and what it means to undertake such a thought experiment. And I'm not alone in considering this. Catherine Yusof describes it Paul Crutzen, who's attributed with having coined the notion of the Anthropocene, describes such a thought experiment. It comes up in the work of Claire Colebrook. Who is it that looks back and regards the damage that we've undertaken at a planetary scale? And when we look at mining ventures, this, of course, you know, these ventures are amongst the most destructive on a material level, and involved also with the most massive distributions or redistributions of brute matter, of dirt across the planet Earth. And here I just briefly want to tell you a story, one that I've been working on across a number of pages, a number of papers and chapters at the moment, and that is a story that's quite close to home, in fact close to where I grew up in Western Australia. On the weekend of the 23rd to the 24th of May 2020, the ground in the vicinity of what the mining giant Rio Tinto calls Brockman 4 in the Hamersley Range is dynamited in order to chase a rich seam of iron through the red earth, estimated at 8 million tonnes and estimated to be worth $135 million. In the process of this extractivist venture, ancient Indigenous cave shelters in Juukan Gorge, where signs of continual ritual use extend over 46,000 years into deep geological time, are destroyed. The Putu, Kunti, Kurama and Pinikura peoples suffer in the aftermath. A desire for red dirt that once processed becomes the steel that composes, for instance, the fast-growing cities in China, is pitted here against Indigenous heritage. It was only after this massively destructive event took place, it was only after this moment that finally a new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Council was being sort of reproposed. Because what the Indigenous custodians had to deal with in this Western Australian context was a vastly outdated 1972 Aboriginal Heritage Act, which had become of no use in attempting to avoid this destruction. In fact, amidst all the articles that were published and the outrage expressed during this period of time earlier in the year, there was further recognised a gag order on the Indigenous custodians, where lawyers for the mining giant Rio Tinto had warned them that they could not speak publicly about the destruction because of an agreement that had been made between the Indigenous custodians and the mining giant. So there was a sort of these voices that have been earlier described have been muted, and it has taken such a destructive event for attention to be drawn to this. So extractivism. Extractivism, as Laura Juncker Aikio and Catalina Cortez Severino, is increasingly understood as an analytical and also a political concept that enables the examination and articulation of deeper underlying logics of exploitation and subjectification that are central to the present conjuncture of capitalist globalization and neoliberalism. We can think of these actions and their effects on multiple bodies, and especially kind of Indigenous claims for sovereignty, according to these kinds of rhythms of dig and dump. This is a particular thematic that I raise in Dirty Theory, this very simple diagram that we have to imagine as multiplied. It's a rhythm that I'm working on in a chapter with my colleague Sepide Karami called Failing Falling Infrastructures, the Spatial Politics of Sites of Extraction, where I look to the events of the destruction of Juukan Gorge, and where Sepide looks to a gold mine in the context of Iran to explore the impacts of extraction and to venture into this domain that has been called extractivism. In my dirty drawing, Dig and Dump, in Dirty Theory, I illustrate a simplistic relation between the resources we dig up and the trash we dump when we have exhausted the perceived use value of the things that resources have been ingeniously moulded into. This is an ancient cycle, dig and dump, that has accelerated dangerously following the Industrial Revolution. And what I do in my book is I invite the reader to multiply this thought image ad infinitum in order to understand the concatenating impact of our collective dirty habits. This further includes the exploitation and exhaustion, as I've said, of labouring bodies and the persistence of material acts such as colonisation, that colonisation continues, that we see it at work when Rio Tinto attempts to gag the Indigenous custodians of the Hamersley Range. We have a number of thinkers, scholars venturing into this domain to speak further of this dig and dump rhythm. We have, for instance, Jane Hutton, who speaks expressly to indentured labour, effectively slave labour, that endured despite the abolishment of slavery from 1833 in the across the British Empire and in 1865 in Peru. She tells the story in her book Reciprocal Landscapes of the harvesting of guano, which is effectively bird shit. So this is the image of that strange mountain there. It's hundreds and thousands of years of accumulated bird shit. And as it turns out, guano is a fantastic fertilizer. So Hutton tells the story of the harvesting of guano from the Chincha Islands outside of Peru and how it's shipped in the 1860s to New York and spread across Central Park as a fertilizer. This is what she means by her reciprocal landscapes, the islands off the coast of Peru, the Chincha Islands, and then Central Park in New York. They both bear a material relation to each other based on the redistribution of this material stuff that is guano. And in the midst, we have to accept that part and parcel of this material is the slave labour that was effectively used, a captive labour force of Chinese who are mobilised across this site under the most brutal of conditions, which Jane Hutton explores in this chapter. Interestingly, prior to the use of guano in Central Park, in the earlier 1800s, the park had been broadly fertilised by what's called night soil. That is the collected, excreted dirt, the shit of an urban population. We have too, in this story of extractivism, the work of Martin Arboleda, who speaks of the planetary mine. That is the notion, again, of extractivism at a global scale and how it has material planetary impacts and also again involves a multitude of human labouring bodies and their relations amidst what he identifies as a new international division of labour. And here he draws on Marx for his analysis. He argues that in the planetary mine, former relations or notions of centre and periphery are undone. What we have on a global scale is a radical ethno-racial and socio-spatial fragmentation, he writes. He speaks of exploited producers in factories and the subjugated consumers in households, both, all sort of messed up in the planetary mine. We also have Brenna Bandar's arguments within colonial lives of property. So we could say that Bandar drives the dirty nail home, stressing the inextricable relation between property, racialization, and exploitation. She argues that the emergence of modern property laws come alongside a history of land appropriation and colonial capitalist modes of accumulation. She argues that property ownership can be understood as complicit in fabricating racial difference and gender identities. Property is a kind of dirt that we manage. It's tied up in settler colonialism. It produces a property identity nexus, argues Bandar. How, she asks in conclusion, do we decolonize this property identity nexus? So, she also looks to the colonial histories of Australia. So again, for me now, being based in the Australian context, this is close to home. And it's worth mentioning here that with early colonisation, a kind of colonisation that we see continuing in many ways, there was enunciated this conceit of Australia as terra nullius, that is, a political fabrication of an empty earth, of vacant dirt, which was at that early moment of colonisation one of the first of many violent gestures of erasure of the ancient land use practices and management of land use management of Indigenous Australians, a growing recognition of which can be found in the works of Bruce Pascoe and Gamage, I think it is, who talks about the management, the careful agricultural management of land by the Indigenous custodians. So what do we do? What directions do we take? We can tell such stories as we find in Jane Hutton's Reciprocal Landscapes, for instance. We can undertake in our research and our practices, again, this ethos of following the material. We can follow the material if we have it within us, you know, toward an ethics of matters of care. And here I want to draw attention, and I do so in the book, to a large number of sources that pay attention to care ethics. So how we bring back care into the picture, how we share as our matters, how we share and identify our matters of care, as Maria Puig de la Bella Casa describes them, how we acknowledge our locations. Care, of course, itself is not straightforwardly a happy and positive relationship. It can also become a domineering relationship. We can be cared for in a way that we find oppressive. So, for instance, the early colonial caring of the Australian Indigenous peoples, this could be a negative form of care. So it really is a matter of managing our matters of care and recognising amidst care our material relations. Here's an example of a recent exhibition and book that went with an event that took place at the Architecture Centrum in Vienna, convened by Angelika Fitz and Elke Krasner, where they look to questions of care in the context of the works of architecture and urbanism, drawing on a history of feminist philosophy dedicated to an ethics of care, whether we look to the early work of Carol Gilligan, who posits care against justice as a framework, or to Virginia Held, or to Joan Tronto, who has a chapter in this book, Critical Care, or to Nancy Fraser, who speaks of the crisis of care that we suffer under amidst neoliberal capitalism, or toward Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who draws attention to care also amidst our human and non-human or multi-species relations. Finally, now I want to conclude, though, again with Mary Douglas, this ethnographer who gives us the definition of dirt as matter out of place, because dirty theory, it must look for also moments of opportunity. We must find the means of coping, of acting somehow. And this we find in Douglas, this promise somehow of the creative capacities of staying with the trouble that is dirt. And I quote her, "In its last phase then, dirt shows itself as an apt symbol of creative formlessness. But it is from its first phase that it derives its force. The danger which is risked by boundary transgression is power. Those vulnerable margins and those attacking forces which threaten to destroy good order represent the powers inhering in the cosmos. Ritual which can harness these for good is harnessing power indeed." So what Douglas is remarking upon is the role of dirt. Again, that dirt is ambivalent. In some contexts, it's good and fostered. In other contexts, it's that which we want to rid ourselves from. But it's in our very relationship with dirt that we create our capacity to sort of work alongside each other in the world. So how can we best harness it for a sort of enabling projects amidst ourselves and non-destructive projects? This becomes the final challenge of dirt and dirty theory. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So it would be now great to turn on our cameras and start discussion already. And Helen actually will be joining us in a minute, so we can, I mean, minute, maybe 10 minutes. So we will have a chance to also prepare some of our best observations and questions. I mean, I found it personally very, very interesting that Helen is a professor at the School of Architecture, although she is a philosopher. And that, you know, for instance, this is a position that we do not have currently at the ETH, right? So the kind of philosophy of as an entry point to architectural theory and practice, right? And I think it's really, it does give this kind of a sweeping perspective and linking many issues kind of historically, theoretically, and so on. So I'd be curious to hear you, and perhaps to start with questions, but also perhaps what you found inspiring, enriching, and so on. For instance, I was really fascinated by the dirty drawing. I love it very much. It's super. I find it super, super inspiring. It would be really interesting to work with it as a kind of concrete tool in many different projects. Shall we address the problem of dirt? I think it's interesting. Helen, thank you so much, and it's great to have you back. It was a wonderful and dynamic talk, even though it was pre-recorded. So we felt, I think it really felt as you were kind of continuously with us. I mean,
it's a bit hard to tell, isn't it, with these mediated worlds? I could have been.
Yes, exactly. And so it's interesting. I mean, you know, it's interesting. Let's say Swiss society, I think, is perhaps especially, you know, interesting, you know, if it's approached through the perspective of dirt and dirty theory, right? So Switzerland is remarkably kind of homogeneous and orderly and clean, right? And it's almost impossible to look for this kind of dirty pockets, right? And if we take dirt as perspective in Switzerland, let's say in architecture, in urbanism, I feel that there is a lot of, I would say that there is almost a kind of a social consensus around orderliness. You know, we have created this, we have earned this, we have created this order. It's a hard-won kind of island of, you know, hard-won condition of this island of stability, and don't you poke into you know, the kind of
and I know, but I mean,
yeah,
what a disturbing vision you're describing. You know, the fully cleaned up world that is you know, the nation state of Switzerland, because then the pressure that is assumed here, how all the work that must be done to keep it clean or to keep out you know, the abject or the unwanted, it becomes a quite disturbing image. So the most clean environments seem, in some ways, are almost the most threatening, because it just presumes either all the unseen labor. For instance, you know, I was drawing attention to Merlu Cayley's, you know, very famous performance pieces where she's cleaning the steps of an institution to draw attention to that invisible labor, or, I mean, you know, the migrant labor that's undervalued or unseen, or that we don't want to acknowledge, that's sort of propping things up, or I think I cited in one of the final slides, Nancy Fraser, who speaks of a crisis of care that attends capitalism, with the idea of the two-earner family, which presumes that we've sort of imported that migrant carer to look after our children. So all of these relations are relations that mobilise the theoretical aspect of dirt. So this is where the dirty theory comes in, I suppose. Because, you know, it's where are we kind of moving our dirt so that we don't have to deal with it, you know, how are we kind of outsourcing that labor and so forth.
Yeah.
And it says a lot about our societies.
Absolutely. And I think it's felt here, I mean, this type of outsourcing is felt here especially strongly, and it's always, you know, I think this kind of idea that it's someone else's problem, right? Or that problems are essentially elsewhere and not here. You know, and that we are in a way privileged, but it's also because of our I think the kind of underlying message that there is a certain righteousness about it. We have earned that, right? We have through our, you know, actions, we have earned that position, right? So it's interesting, and I would perhaps I'm curious if students would like to reflect on that relationship, kind of let's say the perspective of dirty theory in relation to practice in Switzerland, right? Or kind of practicing architecture and urbanism in Switzerland. I think that gives a very, very good opening, perhaps.
Maybe I can jump in here because sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
It's super interesting because it really touches on our project in the studio that we're dealing with, and we were wondering also about this two-class system that emerged through capitalism, or this externalization of this cleaning and caring work. And now I think maybe you had some projects and you worked with the studio, so I'm wondering like how to and you showed some stuff, but how can you really integrate it and give it what value again without like saying that everyone has to clean their own stuff? Or
could you tell us, Rachel, just in two sentences, what is the studio you are currently part of?
Yeah, it's Caruso, and I'm dealing with like making plans for living, and then we were looking at the reference, and our topic is the maintenance and repair part, and cleaning and care also, which also all connects together. And we looked also a lot about your work, and then we're dealing with an office building where usually people come in and out and go in the morning, clean it, and they're always invisible and unseen. And now we're starting to make it more important, and like time-wise and architecturally, how to connect it together and give value. Like, do people have to also do some stuff and contribute? Definitely, or you know what I mean? It's like it's super interesting to how to emancipate people and connect it together and again give it value.
I mean, it sounds like an incredible exercise, and if I understand you correctly, it's like reorientating the sorts of things we tend to privilege when we undertake the act of design. You know, so if I'm hearing you right, then it's like undertaking an act of design by understanding how people are sort of moving in and out of the spaces, caring for the spaces, reorientating our attention. And I think this becomes what the challenge for architectural design exactly is. Something that I quite often, you know, wonder about architectural design is how do we best educate becoming architects in understanding when acts of design are simply not necessary. You know, can my job be offering spatial advice where I say, no, you don't need that extension, or, you know, you don't need to, you know, remove that kitchen and put in a new one, or, oh, we could just mend this existing building and make it work for your purposes. You know, imagine if we could expand the suite of skills that a creative practitioner, a designer, an architect had to revalue other sorts of acts. I don't know, that's what your project makes me think of a little bit. I also think that it's very important for architects to recognise labour relations, the fact that we are labourers in a kind of service industry and that this takes time. Our profession is known for having very poor work-life balance. You know, we have deadlines that we have to meet. It's kind of boom and bust. So to recognise we are labourers working alongside broader networks of labourers, you know, on the building site or in, you know, municipality offices and so forth. And to think of those interconnections, I think is very valuable too, and recognise them as part of a broader domain of architectural work. In fact, there's wonderful work being undertaken by, I'm going to forget her name now, the architect as worker. Is it Barbara Penner? I always muddle up Barbara Penner with, I don't have a name in front of me, and I don't think it's Barbara Penner, it's someone else, but there is interesting discourse emerging in architecture, refocusing on the architect as a worker. That's really valuable to look into, I think. That
it's Peggy Deemer.
Peggy Deemer, that's it. I've got this weird thing where I always muddle up that Barbara Penner, who's at Bartlett, with Peggy Deemer. I don't know why I do it. It's like, you know, your head does weird things. Yeah, so Peggy Deemer's work's really inspiring, I think, on this, asking us to think about architecture in a different way. Yeah.
Great. Sounds really exciting. I mean, I think, or I would ask, so the kind of rethinking of labor relationships, right? So these asymmetries, of course, are deep and entrenched and run across, you know, a kind of a
planetary. It's a planetary
I mean,
thing.
they are in a way. It's a kind of enmeshed at the planetary level and across the very different coordinates, including race, gender, etc., etc. And you know, the one point is to simply recognize them. And I think what I have also felt often with my students, I mean, there is a kind of limitation of architectural design. I mean, one can expose, but one cannot fundamentally address or fix, right? So the project, architectural project. So for instance, we've been looking recently at seasonal or migrant workers in agriculture in Switzerland, right? So the entire agricultural sector is basically dependent on migrant labor from other parts of European Union and other countries due to the pay gap. And those relationships are so entrenched in Switzerland. I mean, this situation has been there since probably 30, 40, 50 years. So let's say since the 80s, there is a kind of escalation in that labor importation. And it has become a certain kind of normalcy, right? So there is, in a way, a general acceptance, even on the right end of the political spectrum, which actively, to say so, pursues a to say so, migrant politics, you know, or you know, let's say pursues the kind of politics of let's say well, basically restrictions to work migration in Switzerland, right? And you know, so I think it is possible, and I think we can do a lot in exposing these practices, in putting these issues in the public arena, in debating, you know, with various protagonists in a society. But, you know, I think that the limitation comes when you are at the point to redesign a worker dormitory, right? Which is, you know, an object in a landscape in Switzerland. I think there is the ultimate, to say so, impossibility to address. I mean, we can, to say so, improve the condition, and improvement is ultimately cosmetic, right? We cannot address the core asymmetry, right, through the architectural tools, right? And I think very often we see that effort to kind of make I think through architecture, to say so, a good gesture, right? Let's make it a better place, right? And I think this is perhaps, you know, the question is, how do we articulate in our profession the right tools, no? To you know, in which arena should we refrain from doing architectural projects? Should we focus on, to say so, theoretical projects? You know, I think this is the kind of one of the questions that I find interesting in this field. I wonder if you have perhaps a thought.
I think this is one of our fundamental ethical dilemmas. An old colleague of mine called it Daedalus's dilemma. If we think of one of the first architects, you know, producing the labyrinth in which to capture the Minotaur, do we say yes or no when presented with a project if that project means our very livelihood? But I think it is possible to at least be ethical in our work. I mean, this is surely something that we're obliged to attend to, but there's no doubt about it. It's a very difficult challenge. But I do wonder whether architecture, being the sort of very diverse discipline it is, it lends itself to so many sort of different sort of forms of engagement. So, you know, we're architects working in the academy, we can be architects working in the municipality, you know, local government sector. We can be architects in a large company, in a small company. We can be, you know, sole proprietors. There are so many things we can do. And I think amidst all of those roles, we can still hold on to the role of you know, being a public intellectual in the midst of all of that, and seeing what we can do to shift policy frameworks, for instance. In Australia, for instance, we have the Australian Institute of Architects, and due to work happening within the academy, they've reframed their policy statements around attempting to achieve better equity for men and women in positions of leadership in architecture. And they've, you know, addressed centrally issues of the work-life balance. So I think we have a capacity to, you know, push the discussion forward, because this can have an impact. And, you know, good old sort of feminist consciousness raising can actually do some work. So as hard as it is, I think there is some room to move for us in architecture. I think what we want to avoid are the kinds of situations that, you know, Zaha Hadid at the end became somewhat infamous for in her work in the Middle East, where, you know, when discovering the awful condition of labourers, she simply stated this was of no concern to her, or that this was beyond the scope of what she could do, you know. And I think for me that's a very troubling statement to make as an architect, I think. Yeah, but yeah, it's the biggest ethical dilemma.
Absolutely. I think indeed it's about searching for right tools and understanding that our position is multifaceted. We can do more than to say so, making a project in a classical sense, right?
I just want to add as a footnote, let's say, two works that I think are very much in line with this kind of dilemma. Of course, the you know, seminal project by Lacaton-Vassal for the Place Louis-Aucuc that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Basically, they entered a competition with proposing nothing. And saying, that the public square had to be properly maintained, and that they should just basically rebalance their budget and put the money into making the space, let's say, better, rather than put money in a new intervention, which is a very intrinsically political gesture. Of course, maintenance is not something that you can, you know, market in electoral ships, basically. So but it's, I think that's a very important aspect of this conversation. And as architects, we are let's say finding ourselves in these realms where construction matters, and I think that there's a whole discussion here to be had about what is practice. And I think, I mean, I have debated this many times, but if it's also a practice not to build, which I believe it is, in fact, I think that this also has to be discussed. And there is another project which is a bit more, let's say, performative and artistic, but he's also an architect, and that is also an architectural gesture, which is the work of Andrés Jacques, with this intervention at the Mies van der Rohe pavilion, where he basically took the entire guts of the building, so the kind of basement where all the dirt, literally the dirt, and then the kind of tools of maintenance that are in the basement and kept away are basically made visible and brought to the surface as a way to materialize all this kind of invisible labor and all the mechanics that allow for this architectural icon to keep on being there, which is also, again, this question of maintenance and how this is like intrinsically a political question, So yeah,
I love these examples, and I'm aware of the square that Lacatan and Basal, propose nothing for, and I suppose also that it very much appeals to my perhaps slightly absurdist sense of humor. I mean, I think a whole book collecting such interventions, or how architecture, the right to refuse, for instance, and collecting those kinds of projects. There's I mention it in my book Creative Ecologies, but there's a US-based architect called Alex Schweider, who I first met him in Berlin, and he set up a gallery space where he was offering free architectural advice. And so his way of performing architecture was to have these, basically these analytical sessions with people who'd walk in off the street or organized appointments, and he'd say, well, tell me about your spatial problems. And they'd have this conversation, and then in the end he'd write them some specifications for what they could do about it. And sometimes it would mean like moving the plant out of the shed stairwell into a sunnier spot so it would survive, and they wouldn't have to worry about who was going to care for it, or I don't know. That was just one example that I seem to remember. And but yeah, we've got to look at these carefully, because we could also say, oh, well, it's all very well for Lacatan and Basal. They have an established career, recognized projects, and there is something quite special going on with them. They're a great example. It turns out that the panel that I had to sit on before included Elke Krasny, who recently at the Architecture Zentrum in Vienna with Angelika Fitz mounted a full exhibition about notions of critical care, including, of course, Lacatan and Basal and the sorts of gestures they make, renovating a social housing block in such a way as to try and avoid moving all the inhabitants out so that it wouldn't result in them losing their homes, and then making gestures that are simply about claiming as much space as possible and using relatively simple construction techniques and a very limited palette of material to do that, the limited palette of material that they're known for across their works. But yeah, I think well, obviously there's no simple answer, but one day when I get enough time, I want to collect a book of many of these examples, both with a slightly performative edge, as well as, I like that space, I think, where architects meet that moment of art and sort of become performative. The André Jacques example that you give. Yeah.
There is a question coming from a student. I don't know, Leonard, if you want to kind of ask directly.
Yeah, maybe I would like to thank you, first of all. I was wondering whether the idea of dirty theory could be kind of looked upon also as a model vis-a-vis the pandemic or the current times of sterilization. And how the pandemic kind of, often is regarded as a magnifying glass and could be used as a magnifying glass, looking at our practice of architecture from a different perspective. One that would also put in focus more the dirty construction side, for example.
Oh no, for sure. I mean, given our extreme anxiety around hygiene and having to protect ourselves, you know, from infection, from, you know, this highly infectious virus that, as it turns out, is left behind on surfaces for, you know, a couple of days afterwards. And this whole, the return to this sort of, actually Judith Butler writes a beautiful essay, or she writes an essay about this, drawing attention to the fact of all the things that we touch around us. You know, in the early days we're warned not to touch our face, but, you know, we're touching things constantly without even realizing it, and how through the simple act of touch, you know, managing things, manual management, we're passing the virus around. We're kind of spreading it all over our spaces and making it a spatial problem, which is, you know, so absolutely you could use this sort of question of dirty theory, this sort of methodology, which, as I keep on stressing, this is not mine. This is kind of cobbled together and gleaned from many sources. We could use it to think through some of the spatial after effects of the pandemic. It's funny, what keeps on coming into my head though, is there have been, you might have noticed on social media and elsewhere, a number of different examples of how different forms of protection have been devised so that people could embrace each other without infecting each other, you know, so that they could contain their own contaminants, so to speak, but still, you know, reach out. And there's a wonderful friend and colleague of mine in the Stockholm context, Bettina Schwarm, who designed this huge proposed instructions for how you would collect your plastic bags, which are obviously an issue when people go out shopping. You know, one shouldn't use plastic bags, but you can collect them, cut them together, create a huge inflatable pillow, and then you hug each other by squeezing either end of it, you know, so you get this kind of pneumatic responsivity, and this is how you hug. With this adequate separation. So yeah, I mean, there are dozens of things. I mean, that you know, you've just given yourself a task, write a series of essays using dirty theory to discuss the spatial implications of the pandemic. For sure. Yeah, and it is a lens, you're right, very nicely put, by which we relook at our spatial relations.
Maybe I have a question here. Hello, nice to see you.
Oh, Maria.
Okay, I'm gonna try and put on active speaker so I can. Yeah, it's hello.
Thank you so much for a very nice lecture and super interesting set of tools and examples. I really like how you managed to take dirt as this kind of conceptual tool on one side that cuts across questions of dealing with actual soil, with actual dirt and practices of maintenance, extraction, and on the other hand, kind of to frame it as a feminist approach to architectural theory. So I think what you say, following the material, is kind of crucial there for me. So maybe you can maybe to kind of build upon Militz's question on the tools and concepts. Can you say a couple of words? Maybe how do you see your research on fiction in this regard? Is fiction also a project of dirt in a way? Like, could you maybe make a connection?
Great question. I like this a lot. Yeah, so in fact, I've just brought out with a colleague, Naomi Stead, a collection of essays called Writing Architectures, Ficto-Critical Approaches. Ficto-criticism being this particular concept and methodology that emerges almost simultaneously in the Australian and the Canadian contexts. Interesting, because these are both Commonwealth states, that is to say, both, bizarrely enough, their heads of state is, you know, the Queen of England, which just seems totally bizarre in this day and age that we haven't managed to become a republic. Anyway, ficto-criticism becomes this way of receiving, at a certain point through the 80s and 90s, a strange way of receiving French theory into the Australian and Canadian contexts and reformulating it as an experimental approach to writing. Yeah, and what would be the connection between that and dirty theory? Well, in some way, I think I offer some hints to this in the little book, Dirty Theory, because I draw a lot of attention to Jennifer Bloomer's work, which I mentioned in passing with her Tables of Bower, Abodes of Flesh project. in the book, I talk about Jennifer Bloomer's dirty ditties, as in a ditty is like a little saying, and a dirty ditty would be a bit smutty or rude. But when I talk about Jennifer Bloomer's dirty ditties, I mean the ways in which she really messes with language and shows us through her really artful compositional play with language that language has a very material impact. And I think what's interesting, so I'd use Jennifer Bloomer's essays as an example here, because within her essays, storytelling is very fundamental. So the essay Abodes of Flesh, for instance, takes us on a long journey that commences. It's very beautiful, actually. I fully recommend going back and reading it. I've been reading it again recently because we're doing a special edition of the Journal of Architecture dedicated to Jennifer Bloomer. But in this essay, she starts, you know, in the bedroom, on the marital bed, commenting on two different pieces of furniture on either side of the bed, one much more kind of feminine and lace or lattice-like, and one much more kind of sturdy. And then she unfolds from this autobiographical moment a story of the history of Chicago, as it turns out. And she brings up Louis Sullivan, and she talks about the Great Fire of Chicago, and she tells this very elaborate story that results in this this kind of pavilion that she produces, the sort of Tables of Bower, and Tables of Bower playing on the idea of the Tower of Babel, which of course was infamously struck down by God because humankind collaborating together with the one shared language was showing too much hubris. So fiction and dirty theory come together quite nicely in the way in which it matters, well, to cite Donna Haraway, it matters what stories tell stories. So the kinds of stories we can tell of our environmental entanglements, which kind of call on you know, fiction as that means of conveying the story. You know, this can operate quite nicely, I think, that conjunction. And I mean, for those of us old enough who are sort of, you know, still studying in the late 80s and into the 90s, when textuality was all the thing, like, you know, and messing with footnotes, playing with text, messing with words, using punctuation. At that point, it seemed like there was nothing outside the text, to quote, you know, Jacques Derrida. But in fact, what we find increasingly is that it's rather more like text is fully material in its own right too, and it's dirty in the relations that it produces. And yeah, I think that's a long way of saying yes, completely. There are great connections that could be forged, and I've done a little bit of that work in dirty theory. I just ventured around the edges. But I am really enjoying reading more and more into the environmental humanities, where I've discovered that storying or telling stories or composing field notes is a really important approach. And yeah, that's a long answer to that question.
I'm also wondering, I have a question. It's like, I have the feeling the dirty theory is very focused on the ground. What about the water, the dirt on the water? Isn't there like another space that we should explore nowadays?
Oh no, absolutely. That's a really good comment, of course. And I would totally head you in the direction of a wonderful younger colleague of mine called Charity Edwards, who's absolutely dedicated to, I'll write it down in the, she's written on oceanic contexts here in the Australian context. No, absolutely. I know there's I play a lot with notions of soil and earth and that kind of dirt, but for sure, venturing into the oceans and understanding how they're fully populated. In fact, what Charity argues is that we like to imagine that, you know, oceans are sort of out there beyond the urban context, you know, at a distance. We could get lost at sea, but in fact, oceans are fully urbanized spaces, you know, littered with lost shipping containers, tangled with shipping lanes. You know, the seabed is crawling with robots, you know, mining for rare metals or whatever it is that's dug up under the ocean. It's an urbanized, populated space, even though there are still some parts of it that we haven't been able to see with our own eyes, which is probably a good thing. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think this idea of seeing with the own eyes, I want to bring it in the foreground, because like we see dirt in earth and then we talk about it, but I think there's a lot of dirt that we don't see and that it's super present nowadays. So yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Especially when we now think about the pandemics and the aerosol, we talk also about dirt in the air, right? So something we not see is something which is really not tackling us, and maybe it's the idea to call this it doesn't belong to her because she never was probably out there at the construction site and saw the mess which was there. So we're very visually based, right? And when we don't see something, it's always a problem for us.
No, absolutely. In English, out of sight, out of mind, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, which is a challenge then. How do we render it visible? I mean, I think, again, that's what ecologies is attempting to do. And obviously the project that Charlotte was describing with André Jacques, you know, rendering something, bringing it to light, rendering it visible, showing us what we haven't, what has been right before our eyes, but we haven't borne witness to, for sure.
Yeah, maybe a comment. So this actually really brings us to the core of your talk, which I think it's actually not about romanticizing at all, this idea of dirt, but it's more about these actions that are invisibilized in the process of keeping something clean. And maybe this ties really also to the question of Milica, how us as practitioners can contribute. And it's maybe really about visibilizing all the processes that are behind the products, the clean products that we eventually deliver. Either this is our engagement with labor conditions, which most of the times remain invisible, our engagement with resources. So I think it's not about clean or dirty, but about keeping clean or hiding the dirt. And this is really where we contribute and cast light somehow.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I've also noticed, you know, pedagogues like Shannon Matten, who's based at the New School in New York, or, you know, some of the work coming through the Tempelhof Buell Center that Reinhold Martin, I think, is currently directing. Or I've noticed, you know, it's interesting to see that there seems to be, I don't know whether I'm just imagining it, but a revaluation of pedagogies, and pedagogies encouraging students to explore architecture according perhaps to its supply line logics. So for me, I would call this following the materials. So understanding you know, even right down to our sort of basic material choices imply, you know, that iron has been dug up, you know, in the desert in Western Australia. Timber has been sourced possibly in a precarious rainforest in the Amazon that's not being looked after properly. Every material choice suggests these various relations that we've not cared to look to. But that increasingly we really and urgently must, you know, if we're going to in any way hope to be sustainable in a significant way, for sure. I think this is why I noted in the lecture Jane Hutton's Reciprocal Landscapes, which is a very, very accessible and well-written book that I think is, you know, in a way tells stories of across a sequence of chapters, focusing on materials, you know, so we have the guano, which I mentioned, the bird shit accumulating between the island off Peru and New York Central Park. We also have granite. She looks at granite that's being kind of quarried in Maine and brought into New York. New York's her main hub. But she tracks all of these sort of movements of material or mobilizations of material and understands that the landscapes are reciprocal. They bear a relation to each other, and they've had an impact on each other because of what's being done to each. And I think being able, so going back to fiction or storytelling, or how we then convey these stories and understand them, I think they're really valuable within the pedagogical context to sort of, I don't know, render them available. I don't know. I've been really inspired by Anna Singh's Feral Atlas recently, where many people collaborate on offering field notes of, environments, precarious environments, I suppose. And I'm hoping when I do some, go back to some teaching next term, that I might be able to invite my students to see whether they can't write their own field notes based on their own kind of localized environmental relations, or maybe they could focus on a material, or maybe they could focus on, flora or fauna in their local context, and understand the sorts of complex relations that these non-humans are bound within. We'll see.
Actually, we are already over our time. I'm dying to ask you perhaps one question, so I'll just do it. Let's say, and so you're a philosopher, right? And I'm curious. You're teaching at the School of Architecture, so this is an interesting link. We don't have a philosopher on our faculty, right? And it would be a great thing to to do in the future, because I think it's extremely enriching. But I'm curious how. How did this link emerge for you? Was it an accident? Was it let's say, how did your relationship with architecture develop? Let's say.
No, absolutely. I studied architecture first, and I even I was working as a graduate architect after studying 5 years. This was when it was still called a Bachelor of Architecture, before it turned into the Bologna 3+2 model. And the thing was, I was basically living in one of the most isolated cities on the planet, in Perth, Western Australia. And this is why I drew attention to the horrible event at Deepen Gorge in the lecture, because it's kind of quite close to home. And what happened in the sort of mid-90s, something happened in architecture school where I was being introduced, by chance I was being introduced to some feminist philosophers like Luce Irigaray and Adrienne Rich. No, she's not French though, but and a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari. And I was going, who are these people? How do I find out about them? So what I did was, I was bored being a graduate architect, and so I went back to study part-time, and I went right back as an undergraduate and studied philosophy. And then I did my PhD in philosophy. And so basically I've got these two disciplines, and so, philosophy schools are shrinking. It would be far harder to get a job in a philosophy school. And it's really, there's something very joyful about working in an architecture school, because that space of the design studio is one that's so fabulously sort of inventive. And so it produces a really nice space, I think. And yeah, that's how it happened, I guess. Yeah, I tried to escape architecture, but philosophy is possibly even worse.
Great. I think it's it was all super inspiring also, I think, for us, and the kind of really fabulous ideas and thoughts and concepts for really exploration in the studio context, in the kind of things that we do. So I really thank you very much, and I invite everybody for a kind of a virtual applause. And thank you for this.
It was a real pleasure. It was a real pleasure. I'm glad it all worked. I think it's a minor miracle.
Yeah, it worked really well. It's fabulous. Yeah.
Thank you so much for letting me do this outrageous thing.
Thanks. It was amazing.